It's been a little more than a week now since the UK voted itself out of the European Union, and amidst the resulting chaos in the political and economic spheres, the resignation of Prime Minister David Cameron, the steep drop in the value of the British pound, we've also seen developments on the media side of this story. Rupert Murdoch's tabloid, The Sun, which backed Brexit, claims that it swung the vote and may well have a point. There's also been a post-referendum tonal shift. Newspapers that during the campaign backed the Leave side, arguing that Britain needed to reclaim its sovereignty and billions in transfer payments from Brussels, are now warning of tough times ahead, a narrative more in line with what papers on the Remain side were saying before the vote. An overarching critique that papers on both sides are hearing is about detail. There was far too little of it during the campaign coverage, and it came much too late. British broadcasters work under regulations written to ensure that both sides get their say. But were those channels really as impartial as they claim to be? Our starting point this week is London.
The UK electorate has taken the historic decision to withdraw from the European Union.
To the victors go the headlines, although Britain's right-wing press did rather spoil the party. After months of championing Brexit, using their front pages like blunt instruments, hammering their readers with anti-EU headlines, their moment of triumph was tempered by a clear change in editorial tone.
Amongst the newspapers that supported Leave, there was a certain amount of gloating. But there was also, interestingly, a certain amount of caution. The Daily Mail, for example, that was very clearly in favour of Leave, was also writing about some of the economic problems that lay ahead, something it had pretty much failed to do during the campaigns.
It was almost as if the newspapers were thinking, what have we done here? And you had, for example, the Express starting to talk about what this is going to mean for the pound, the value of the pound, which prior to that had never entered into any of its coverage at all.
The immediate media reaction was quite triumphalist in some sectors of the media, particularly in the tabloid media, and rather horror-stricken in most of the non-tabloid media. The Telegraph, amazingly, announced Boris Johnson's programme for what should happen next as a newspaper column, which is a very interesting example of use of the media, but rather than discussion in Parliament or in some serious public forum, a newspaper column set out what has been the most coherent statement so far of the Brexiters' policy proposals going forward.
Boris Johnson and his cohort in the Leave campaign, Michael Gove, are both former journalists. Typical journalists, in that they have proven to be better at messaging than planning. A point that was brought home by Sky News' political editor the weekend after the vote.
I said to him, so where's the plan? Can we see the Brexit plan now? There is no plan. The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan.
But for journalists to call out politicians for a lack of foresight is a little rich, given the limited focus of the coverage leading up to the vote. Reporting that dwelled on personalities delivering the speeches and hot-button topics like immigration, but failed to dig deeper and properly address the larger question, what if?
We know from the research that's been done now on the news coverage of the campaign that immigration, the economy and the conduct of the campaign itself dominated all the coverage. So actually those technical questions, vital issues for the future of the UK and our relationships with the rest of the world really weren't debated at all.
People who complain that the media didn't give enough coverage to what the options would be if Britain voted to leave, I think probably weren't paying very close attention. I certainly had seen various different Brexit scenarios explored.
It cannot be denied that there was very little discussion on the substance of what the process would be. And we are seeing, I think, the limitations not just of Britain's government and not just of Britain's political class, but we're seeing the limitations of the media in dealing with events which they did not expect.
What Britons are not seeing are limitations in the power of the press. 5 years ago, it looked like they might. After the phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's tabloids, a lengthy judicial inquiry into politics and the press recommended the UK papers be regulated. The Cameron government, backed by Murdoch and other press barons, rejected the idea. And Cameron was backed by those papers when narrowly re-elected last year. But not this time, and Murdoch's tabloid The Sun proudly claims to have swung the referendum vote. Its editor, Tony Gallagher, was quoted in The Guardian saying, "So much for the waning power of the print media."
I would take Tony Gallagher's comments with a pinch of salt. In an electoral contest in which the margin of victory is so narrow, any number of people who campaigned for the winning side can claim that they made the critical difference. They put their side over the top. So I don't buy this narrative that's emerging that the reason the British electorate voted for Brexit is because they were misled by a team of dishonest, conniving politicians in cahoots with the media.
I think it's still the case today that The Sun does have an important influence on the votes of its readers, because many of the readers of The Sun, more than other newspapers, aren't actually particularly active online, aren't active especially on new media in any political sense, and don't get an awful lot of news sources to compare it with. So The Sun probably not only has many readers, it probably does have more influence over its readers than many other newspapers.
And influence over viewers as well, because the UK papers often set the news agenda for broadcast journalism. 70% of the newspapers sold in Britain are conservative. Many of them echoed one of the Leave campaign's primary messages, fear of immigrants. The Remain side relied on scare stories as well, of what would happen to the UK economy. But, as The Guardian reported, quoting a senior Remain official, economic fear messages are fine if they're going to be echoed every day in the right-wing press, creating an echo chamber that the broadcasters have to follow. But the press was never on our side.
BBC in particular, it was more impartial than the press coverage, but it tends to follow an agenda that is set by the press.
Look at the papers that have 5 times the circulation of the Financial Times.
And all news media follows that press agenda, and one of the reasons for that is that actually they have an awful lot of space to fill now, and fewer journalists, and the kind of news agendas that are out there just get recirculated.
BBC, who are terrified of certain right-leaning newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and the newspapers owners, because they imagine they can do the BBC harm, they were terrified of accusations from that side that they weren't impartial. And what that meant was that they couldn't make editorial judgments. So if a very well-respected economic research group came up with a claim that clearly favoured Remain,
standing alone, UK loses the bargaining capacity.
They would balance that with somebody from the Leave side saying, oh, that's a lot of nonsense.
If we leave the EU, we will be able to negotiate those free trade agreements on our own.
With no evidence to back it up. And therefore the viewer thinks, well, that's kind of equal.
Brexit is a political story with multiple media subplots. 2 former journalists who led the Leave campaign with sound bites ready and no real plan. A prime minister who refused to regulate the press, brought down by a referendum in which the press boasts it played a decisive role. A story that will run and run, one that will continue to be told by and entrusted to some of the same newspapers that claim to have made it happen. On the download now, our viewers on the continuing coverage of Britain's referendum on the EU.
The broadcast media did a much better job than the news, despite the difficulties they faced in creating a kind of equal debate in appearance between Leave and Remain. And if you look at the press now, they're kind of rowing back from their extreme rhetoric, especially in the right-wing press, because we've had this surge of hate crimes and racist attacks in Britain, and suddenly the press has kind of dialed down their language.
Much of the content in the lead-up to the debate was incredibly inflammatory, It was mostly politicians criticising one another, making outlandish statements. Now we're seeing a lot of the people who did vote are actually saying that had I known some of the information that I know now, rather than seeing inflammatory content on what everyone's saying before, they may have actually voted differently.